Okay, I've been asked if I can have a look at section 3 of the philosophy exam, which is the essay. Um, this has changed in this cycle. There was probably a little bit more room in the previous cycle, but what you're dealing with this year um, is the ability to write an essay and really focus on how these thinkers are thinking about the good life in light of technological development. So that's what we're going to be having a look at, but I'm mainly going to be focusing on how you should be writing, some do's and some don'ts. I'll try and keep this quick, so let's get going. You've probably heard all this before. Your teacher will have gone through with you about all of this. It's fairly similar to the qualities of a good essay in history and in English and in literature. They each have their own quirks, but an essay is effectively a piece of written communication. Good written communication is clear, it guides the reader, it is organized, and it actually says something. It's not just retelling the story. So let's get into it. Qualities of a good essay should be clearly written. You probably heard the phrase KISS, keep it simple, stupid. A lot of young writers, in my experience, I worked at university once, and a lot of first year students were the worst for this, where they try and overwrite, they try and sound clever with these sentences that go forever and using every big word when they can possibly use a big word. It's not about using big words. It is about using the right word, being precise. If the big word is the right word, use it. If a simple word does the job and is clearer, use it. Okay. Your essay wants to be logically organized. This is really important. The examiners don't just want you to retell what Aristotle says about the good life. They want you to guide them through a clearly argued piece. Got to keep in mind that the people who are going to mark your essays will be marking hundreds of these essays. Nearly all the essays are going to look the same. They're going to deal with the same material. So they can blur into one. If you're not really clear, they have to search for what you mean. And if they have to search for what you mean, they'll get tired and they'll get grumpy and they'll mark you down, even if you've basically got it there. So you want to really flag your points. You want to be clear with, you hear about topic statements and etc. So you want to be really clear about that. Okay. Demonstrate an in-depth knowledge of the concepts that you're dealing with, the arguments that are available, the viewpoints, the issues, and the big ideas. I think in section 3, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. This essay, it's relating the philosophers you've studied to the big ideas is the key. This is where they want to see you just haven't studied a bunch of philosophers, but you are now thinking philosophically and you are applying the ideas you have to relevant ideas, contemporary issues, things that matter. They want to show that what you've studied, they want you to show that what you've studied matters and that you can see how it affects the world you live in. They want you to show that you understand the relationship between these and the prompt. Okay, that idea between these and the prompt, I'm going to emphasize this, the wording in the prompt. Keep using it throughout your essay. Keep going back to it. Whenever you feel like you're starting to go off track a bit, go back and look at that key wording in the prompt. What language have they used in the prompt, and then reuse that to draw the reader back and make them know that you are thinking about the prompt. You're not just writing everything that comes into your head. Includes what is necessary to answer the question and nothing extraneous. That's the other key point. A lot of students really feel like they want to show off. They want to show everything they know. And so they put stuff into their essays that really doesn't need to be there. As a result, it loses organization. Okay, it becomes less clearly written, and it starts to show that you don't really understand the concepts, because if you understood them, then why have you put this piece in? You didn't need this piece. You've just put it in there because you're trying to show, oh, I learnt this. Okay, that's the really important bits, the qualities of a good essay. These are the big problems with essay writing. You can pause this, you can read it, so I'll just read it through really quickly. Many students do not answer the question. Many students struggle to relate the arguments and viewpoints expressed within the set topics to the prompts. There's that again. Many essays are indiscriminate rather than relevant arguments and viewpoints from the set text used to support discussion of the prompts. Students outline all the arguments. Expositions are superficial. Many students struggle to walk the reader through the reasoning for a given conclusion. Some students appear to be more prepared, yet to be using prepared responses. Many students struggle with evaluation. Often students will spend the majority of the time on exposition, telling the reader what's happening, and only give cursory attention to evaluation. Evaluation is going to be your key to getting the top level answers in section C. Or it's called section 3, C or 3, I can't remember now. Rather than evaluating the arguments in terms of the question, students often simply evaluate the arguments. Students often appear unsure of what to evaluate. Many students struggle with discussions of contemporary debates. You will have heard all this before. All of this is in the examiner's feedback. You should have read the examiner's report from last year, and you should have looked at the sample essay that was given, or the sample exam that was given to us, and last year's exam, read the examiner's reports. Many of the thinkers we're looking at, Nietzsche, Aristotle, Plato, these thinkers were actually in the previous unit as well. In the previous unit, you had the option of looking at happiness, or the good life, in terms of technology, altruism. There was a few different areas that you could apply it to. Now, what they've obviously found is that students were struggling when they were given a choice of areas, so they've narrowed it down to technological developments. I don't personally like that, but that's what they've done. So they've narrowed it down to technological developments this cycle of 4 years. So these discussions of contemporary debates, you should be looking at some contemporary debates around technological development. That should help you when you go into this. Let's keep playing along. Problems with evaluation. Using personal opinion to support claims. For example, I disagree because I'm a physicalist. Who cares? We do not care what you are. I do not care. They do not care what you think. That is not a reason to disagree. Failing to provide adequate reasons for conclusions. For example, I agree because the premises are true and the conclusion logically follows on from the premises. Socrates' argument is convincing because it is well argued. We get that one a lot. Examiners get that one a lot. Socrates' argument, whoever's argument, is convincing because it's well argued. You're not saying anything. You've got to explain what the argument is. Okay? Misinterpreting the directive to evaluate and instead further elaborating on the argument presented. This is one that actually turns up in English. If any of you are studying English as well, you'll know that there's a section in the English exam where you have to evaluate an argument. A lot of students fall into the trap. They look at the topic. Let's say, for example, the topic was about global warming, and they passionately want to argue for global, that global warming is real and that we should do something about it. So instead of evaluating the argument as it is presented in the article, what they do is they start going off on their own little high horse about what they think about global warming, what their arguments are, what all the arguments are. You're not being asked to do that, no matter how good it is that the argument is that you present. You're not going to get marks for it, and in fact you'll get marked down for it because it shows that you do not understand the task. Restating the argument, I believe that a life of pleasure is good because if we allow our desires to expand, we feel more pleasure. Good, brilliant. You haven't evaluated, that's obviously Callicles. You haven't evaluated Callicles, you're just basically saying that's what he says. Evaluating the wrong argument or unrelated arguments, accusing the philosopher of oversights not committed. Aristotle fails to provide any reasons for why we have a function. It's just not true. He does. He provides the reasons. And that is not an evaluation. A lot of kids feel that, oh, Aristotle says this. I don't agree with him. I've got to evaluate him, so I'll just say he doesn't support it. Okay, providing convoluted, indiscriminate, imprecise, overwritten, and poorly organised responses. Bang. Evaluation is the process we use to decide whether or not we have been given sufficient grounds for accepting a particular conclusion. Evaluation involves assessing the logic of an argument. How well do the premises support the conclusion? I'm certain you will have gone through all the ideas of the logic of an argument, whether it is valid, sound, cogent. You should have gone through that material, so you should be able to assess the logic of a particular argument. However, not all of our thinkers present arguments in that way. The most obvious example there is Nietzsche, who's not presenting arguments in this way. So you're not going to be able to do that. And that's some students fall into the trap of feeling that is purely what they have to do for an assessing a thinker. They just assess the argument. But of course, they'd be stuck with Nietzsche. That's not enough. It's something. It's a good starting point. It's an element of evaluating an argument, but it's not enough. What else do you have to do? Assessing the reasons used to support the conclusion. How plausible are the premises? Okay, or the premise. Let's keep going. Evaluation always involves providing reasons which show the reader or the listener why a particular argument should or shouldn't be accepted. Identifying the problems, the flaws, the fallacies with the argument. Demonstrating why this aspect of the argument is problematic by providing reasons and, if possible, a concrete counterexample. Identifying what the problem does to the argument. That's important. Here's the problem, and this is what it does to the argument. This is how it makes the argument weaker or etc. Let's keep going. So let's get into the writing, because that's really what we're here to talk about. I'm going to have a look at writing in terms of some short answer questions, the middle question, the section B, and then the essay. I'm looking at the short answer questions just to try and give you a sense of how these differ to writing in the essay. So here's an example. Critically compare the views of Callicles and Aristotle on the role of pleasure in the good life. I'm certain you're all well aware that section A will include questions from both Unit 3 and Unit 4. The Unit 4 questions, these are the sorts of things you might get. They're usually pretty short and simple. Again, I would really encourage you to look at the examiner's report from last year, but also all of the examiner's reports from you can actually go back 2 further cycles, because Callicles, Aristotle, Nietzsche, they've been in this unit for the last, from memory, 8 years or so. So you should be able to gather a whole range. If you go back, you'll see the same questions appearing again and again, and the examiner's reports will give answers for you. What I would tend to do with my students when teaching is gather every one of these questions together, consolidate the questions that are all the same, and put the examiner's report next to them, and they would go through and they would be able to gather what the examiners are looking for. Right. Critically compare the views of Callicles and Aristotle on the role of pleasure in the good life. What do you need to do here? Provide some account of each philosopher's view on the role of pleasure in the good life. That should be easy. That you should be at this stage now where you can just say, for Callicles, the good life is. For Aristotle, the good life is. Keep it that simple. Okay. Note the similarities and differences between the philosopher's views. Provide some comparative evaluation. Here's an answer to that question. Now, this question is probably only going to be worth in an exam it might be worth 2-3 marks. Okay? So what I've written here may be a little bit much, but if you look back at some of the sample answers that have achieved high marks, you'll see that a strong student can write this much very quickly. Callicles believes that pleasure is synonymous with a good life. Bang. By allowing our desires to expand, there's me showing evidence of the knowledge of the text, which he believes is in line with our natures, we can experience more pleasure and therefore greater happiness. Let's do Aristotle now. Aristotle would agree, so the question said compare the views. So here I am, I didn't just say this is what Aristotle thinks, but I'm adding that agreement part there, which is part of the comparison. Now, I could have said disagree, would have worked just as well. Okay. Aristotle would agree that pleasure comes naturally to us. Please fix the typo. 2 shouldn't be 2 double O, it should be TO. Comes naturally to us. But he would disagree that it is synonymous with the good life because he disagrees with Callicles on what human beings are. Notice I didn't just say he would disagree that it is synonymous with the good life. Because if I did that, I'm not really saying anything. I'm saying that Aristotle would disagree, but I haven't shown that I know why he disagrees if I don't go ahead and put that next little bit in. Because he disagrees with Callicles on what the human beings are. According to Aristotle, we are now I have to follow that up. I have to follow up and say what Aristotle thinks human beings are. According to Aristotle, we are defined by reason. I could have said human beings are defined by reason if I wanted to be even more clear. Thus, a good life is one in which we use our reason to navigate our response to pleasure, rather than allowing our actions to be driven by it. And that was that last bit there is connecting back to Callicles. While it can certainly be argued that using reason to help us navigate pleasure can result in a better life by helping us to avoid pain, Aristotle's argument relies on a view of human nature that seems less plausible than Callicles. Humans seem intrinsically attracted to pleasure. Children enjoy what is pleasurable. Notice I've put a concrete example in there. You don't have to agree with what I've written here. I don't necessarily agree with what I've written here. I'm just trying to demonstrate the comparison and an element of evaluation. Notice the question doesn't say the word evaluate anywhere. What it does say is critically compare. If it just said compare the views of Callicles and Aristotle, I could have stopped without this third paragraph, but it said critically compare, and critical involves evaluate. Critical, obviously, let's be really clear, critical doesn't mean criticize. A critical evaluation might be recognizing the strengths of something. It's still a critical evaluation. The point is it has to evaluate, it has to look at the strengths and the weaknesses, the fors and the againsts, however you want to put it. So let's get back to that evaluative paragraph. While it can certainly be argued that using reason to help us navigate pleasure can result in a better life by helping us to avoid pain, concrete example, Aristotle's argument relies on a view of human nature that seems less plausible than Callicles. Notice I say less plausible rather than wrong. Be precise. It's not about it's less. It's not about it's invalid. It's not about it's wrong. It's about it's less plausible. It's less convincing. Okay. Humans seem intrinsically attracted to pleasure. Children enjoy what is pleasurable. Concrete example. But the notion that pleasure necessarily equals happiness is flawed. Some pleasures, heavy drinking, concrete example, can result in unhappiness, which could have been avoided by applying our reason to pleasure. Thus, it would seem that Aristotle's view of the role of pleasure in a good life is more persuasive. Simply saying, I'm not saying that one argument was wrong, one argument was right. You'll notice I said Aristotle's argument relies on a view of nature that seems less plausible. So I'm recognizing that Callicles' view of what a human is seems more convincing, but But the notion of pleasure equals happiness is flawed, and this is my reason why it's flawed. And for that reason, I find Aristotle's role or view of the role of pleasure more persuasive. I don't say that he's right. I don't say that it's true. I say it has persuaded me. So I have critically compared, I've evaluated both views and drawn a conclusion. Let's just see. From memory, I did this quite a few years ago, and the technology I had wasn't great. So, there we go. So you can see I didn't have a stroke when I was writing this. It's just the technology I had wasn't great, so I didn't have a lovely pen to be able to write all over it. But you can get what I'm getting at here. And let's keep moving on. Example of section B, an extended answer, a 10 mark. These are hard. This was actually done in the first year of the exam. So I'll go through this really quickly because the exam section B now look different to what they did previously. But it won't hurt you just to sort of see the type of questions you can get. Why remember a destructive love affair if you can erase it? If any of you have watched Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, is that the name of the film? Jim Carrey. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Great film. Great for giving you something to talk about in section B. Now, in the previous cycle, the section B questions tended to lean upon being able to apply the thinkers from Unit 3 to contemporary issues like memory erasure. That's because there was a push from all the teachers. They wanted an essay for Unit 3 and an essay for Unit 4. However, the examiners in the end decided that they, for whatever reason, didn't feel that 2 essays was going to work, so they put these 10 marker answers. The ones that are in this cycle tend to be much more geared towards just getting you to compare 2 thinkers in more depth. They're kind of like a more in-depth version of the question we just looked at with Aristotle and Callicles. Won't go into too much. You can have a read through that if you like. Let's jump through it. Again, it's probably worthwhile just hearing this. It might be a bit of fun for you. The film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind explores the idea of memory erasure and alteration. Although the procedure in the film is the stuff of science fiction, the issue of memory erasure is found in contemporary medical cases of dementia and Alzheimer's. You'll notice what I did there was I took the prompt and I made it very immediate and very real. Okay. Moreover, voluntary memory alteration is a current reality of neuropharmacology. The use of the term neuropharmacology, it's showing my examiner that I have not simply studied my philosophers, but I have studied around the areas. I've looked at the contemporary issues that what they're talking about apply to. Philosophically and ethically, this idea raises the question of how our memories, both positive and negative, impact on the development of our personality, our morals, and the questions of personal identity. Instead of me just saying, this has ramifications. Yes, you can always say, this has ramifications. This issue is important. That's about the real... You've got to say why it's important. What are the ramifications? What does it apply to? You could have not studied any of this, right? And write an essay where you say, this is an important issue that has many important ramifications. You sound like you're being clever, but you're not saying anything. Okay? Philosophically and ethically, this idea raises the question of how our memories, both positive and negative, impact on the development of our personality and morals, and the question of personal identity. Notice I've put that phrase personal identity in there because the Unit 3 area of study 2 is personal identity, and I am drawing the examiner back to what we have been studying. I'm showing I know how this fits. A negative memory, such as destructive love affair, might well act as a learning experience that will shape you in a positive manner. However, some negative experiences can result in impacts such as PTSD, where it is harder to argue they have a positive impact. Yet, even in these cases, some people might argue that memory erasure is tantamount to a kind of mental suicide or even a mental murder. Here, and you'll notice I'm using what's called scare marks around the word suicide, around the word murder. What that is doing, they're not quotes, they're scare marks, scare quotations. Okay? That's the phrase that is used in publishing. It means you're drawing the attention to these words. You're drawing your reader's attention to these words to show that these words are ambiguous sometimes, that they are loaded, that they are emotive. Okay? Here it is a matter of how we define a person. If a person were to have their memories altered or removed, are they the same person? I've used why remember a destructive love affair, and I've got to, if a person, here it is a matter of how we define a person. That has been your entire study. So now I've allowed myself to go basically and go, and this is what Locke says, and this is what Hume says. I've gone back to basically the basics of a section A question. And that allows me to, according to Locke, and then I can show I know Locke, I can show his basic idea, I can show some of the experiments he used. I am being really clear to my reader that I've studied what I've studied and what I'm Prince and the Cobbler. I'll let you read that. There's for Hume. Okay. I'll just read the final. The idea of memory erasure questions our ideas of personhood. Negative memories can actually be seen to help us grow in a positive way. If, as Locke says, our self is an objective reality, which is based on our ability to consciously extend our memory, do you notice what I've just done there? I have basically summed Locke up in one sentence. You should be able to do that with all your thinkers. Then any form of memory erasure, even over drinking, is tantamount to the destruction of a person. However, Hume's concept of the illusion of self leaves us open to a choice, albeit a choice that involves the risk of losing one's grip on sanity, which is what Hume speaks of. Right. Now, 2019 to 23 sample examination, section C, essay, 20 marks. This is what I was asked about by one of the students who has been following what we've been posting, and she's asked if we could have a look at section C. So here we go. Here's a section C type question. Now, before we get into it, you'll notice I'm referring to Wolf. Because of the pandemic this year, which is the reason why I decided to put my my resources up online to help students who I know will have you guys have had a really tough year. I have a daughter doing year 12. I know how tough it's been. Any help that I can be, I think is, well, you're welcome, basically. So let's look at this. Not so long ago, technology was held up as the great liberator, which would free us from the tyranny of our daily working lives and deliver us to the supreme gift of personal time. Of course, that has failed to happen. On the contrary, technology has simply ramped up the pace, enslaving a workforce of creating greater demands for increased productivity in ever-decreasing timeframes. What's worse, technology increasingly disconnects us from the task at hand, reducing our connection and stripping the soul from our working practice. We progressively work in an environment that extols the virtue of immediacy. We communicate at greater speed, more frequently, and with more and more people, but often with less depth and personal connection. Right. I remember what I interrupted myself. I was just about to say, with this year and with the pandemic, they have removed Susan Wolfe, from your readings. This question was obviously written for you to use Wolfe. With each one of your thinkers, you should be able to pretty much identify them in a word. Aristotle, function. Most people would say happiness. But the word happiness, eudaimonia, is probably better translated as flourishing. Flourishing, as in achieving your purpose, so your function. So Aristotle, function. Callicles, pleasure. Socrates, what was the word I would always use for Socrates? Oh my goodness, I've gone completely blank. But probably order, I think, is the word I'm thinking of there. The way he thinks the mind should be ordered in line with the order of the macrocosmic universe, which is, of course, in line with the order of the forms. Nietzsche. Now, this is maybe self-development, but freedom certainly would come in with Nietzsche. Freedom also would come in with Callicles, although they're both talking about two different things, so don't confuse those two. And with Wolfe, it would be connection. So as soon as I'm reading that question, I hear the phrase liberator, makes me think of Nietzsche. And enslaving makes me think of Socrates' criticism of Callicles and being enslaved to pleasure. But it also makes me think of Nietzsche. And what's worth technology disconnects us from connection. It makes me think of Wolfe. So even if I hadn't looked at the question, I would probably be thinking, I'm going to write an essay here where I'm going to be focusing on Nietzsche. I might reflect Callicles on Nietzsche to show the different understandings they have of freedom. And I'm going to be comparing Nietzsche with Wolfe. Okay, so let's have a look at the question they wrote. Critically discuss how either Nietzsche or Wolfe might respond to this perspective on the interplay between technological development and the good life. In your response, draw on at least one of the following philosophical concepts: progress, reality, control, dependency, freedom, creativity. Obviously, from that question, you're going to be drawing on things like freedom. It's in the first sentence, which would free us from tyranny. So at least one. You don't need to do every concept. This is, again, I was talking about earlier, where students can get in the habit of trying to discuss everything. And in fact, they'll try and squeeze in, I don't know, progress or reality, and it's not relevant. And it actually shows they don't really understand the thinkers. So planning helps organize your thoughts. You've probably seen this sort of thing. You know, when your time is limited, how long should you spend on each step in the writing process? General rule of thumb: quarter of the time on planning, half the time on writing, quarter of the time on revising and editing. Your 45 minutes on the essay can be divided as follows: 10 minutes, 25 minutes, and 10 minutes. You're probably not going to follow something like that, but do give yourself time to plan. If you have a well-planned essay, it will speed up your writing because it'll stop you going off track. It'll also, when you have those moments when you're writing along and you suddenly go, what the hell am I trying to say? If you go back and look at your plan, you can see your next point. So even if you don't know where you're going with this sentence, you can quickly finish it up and get on to your next point. What happens if you don't plan is you get to those points where you're not quite certain what you're doing, and you just keep waffling and waffling, trying to find your way back into the essay. What are we being asked to do? Critically discuss how either Nietzsche or Woolf might respond to this perspective on the interplay between technological development and the good life. Notice it says either, so you don't have to do both. It's not a compare Nietzsche to Woolf. Okay? Obviously, because what they've done is if you chose Nietzsche, the fact that they've thought Woolf would be a good other option is actually alerting you to the fact that Woolf might be good for you to evaluate Nietzsche through. You don't have to, though. You could evaluate Nietzsche through a whole range of things. But Woolf is actually good to evaluate Nietzsche in that sense. Now, you haven't studied Woolf, or you haven't been asked to study Woolf because of the pandemic. You can still read the article. You can still read through it. I have a PowerPoint on Woolf, which I haven't put up because she's not on this cycle, but if anyone required, I could always put it up. What is this interplay? Technology was held up as the great liberator, which would free us from the tyranny of our daily working lives and deliver us the supreme gift of personal time. However, technology enslaves, it disconnects. What if there were multiple points of view of interplay? What if there's multiple things you could talk about? If the question only asks you to look at one, then aim to identify the various points and then tell your should be reader which one you will consider. Why I think that's good is it shows you're aware of a range of points that you could talk about. But then you say, so there are several points of interplay here. A, B, C, and D. I'm going to focus on C. You could have just started talking about C, whatever that point was, and that's okay. But by recognizing the range, it just makes your reader aware that you are aware. Okay, there are obviously a couple of ideas to explore. Liberation from tyranny, i.e. liberation from suffering. Immediately we think of Nietzsche and his view on suffering. More personal time. How do we spend this time becomes the question. What are we going to do with this time? The idea that technology was held up as the great liberator, it's the idea that instead of having to go and down to the stream to wash clothes, you could throw them in the washing machine. That's therefore going to speed up. There's a concrete example, and concrete examples are important, don't forget. That then gives you free time. If it took an hour to go down to the river to wash your clothes, now you've thrown them in 5 minutes. You've now got 55 minutes of free time. Here's the problem, though. What do we do with that free time? Unfortunately, in our society, to get the washing machine, you need money. To get the money, you need a job. So you spend all your time doing a job to get the money to buy the things that are going to give you free time. But you don't have any free time because you're doing a job. That's that sort of idea. So you become enslaved. So for, say, a Callicles, the idea is going to the river to wash your clothes is work. He doesn't like that. He'd rather throw them in the washing machine. Then he's got 55 minutes of free time, which he can use for pleasure. That's what Callicles is saying. However, to get that washing machine, he has to work. So more personal time, enslavement, and disconnect, we think of Woolf. It's no surprise the paper asks you to choose from either Nietzsche or Woolf. You're probably most comfortable with Nietzsche, so let's choose Woolf. This was done last year. Obviously, Woolf is no longer in your set of readings. It's worthwhile. I'll just go through this very quickly. It's about Woolf, so it's not directly something that you would use. However, the way I've approached it, I hope might be helpful for your approach in your writing of your essays. So we're looking at how technology has led to disconnect from meaning, which is a big thing for Woolf. So if it was a disconnect from, if you were looking at Nietzsche, you might be talking about how technology removes suffering. We might also look at how more personal time might allow more meaning, on the other hand, more opportunity for meaningful practice. Now, in your response, draw on at least one of the following philosophical concepts: progress, reality, control, dependency, freedom, and creativity. At least one. One is okay. Better to do one thing well than several poorly. Progress. Obviously, technology is associated with progress, but doesn't allow us to go into much talk beyond, is this progress? Reality. That one doesn't jump out. If you were looking at, obviously, Plato, Socrates, you'd be looking at a more reality-based question. Control, again, doesn't jump out from the question. Dependency, to a degree, but not strong. Freedom, this fits very much with the question. Creativity, this fits well with opportunities for meaningful activity. So we are looking at how technology has led from a disconnect from meaning. How is meaning related to creativity? What does Woolf say? Okay. So I'm starting to get a picture in my mind about what this essay is going to be. Let's do a basic draft. This is a much more detailed draft than I would write in an exam, obviously. In an exam, I'm probably going to have about half a dozen bullet points of things I want to talk about. How do I get ready for that? Well, I write these sorts of practice, these sorts of plans for all these sorts of topics. I just look at lots of different topic questions and I write lots of plans like this. I'll let you read through all of that. You can see how I'm using concrete examples. I'm trying to go back to the wording in the prompt as much as I can. And Bob's your uncle. Great, excellent. That's an excellent essay. Do's and don'ts, some basics. Callicles might disagree with Nietzsche about the value of suffering. Don't do that. It's just weak. Callicles might disagree with Nietzsche. We want to hear your voice be strong. We want to hear you say, Callicles disagrees with Nietzsche about the value of suffering because of this. Okay, let's try and make it a bit stronger. Callicles would disagree with Nietzsche about the value of suffering. It's better, but not much better, because it doesn't actually demonstrate why. In other words, a student who's not very confident could say, Callicles might disagree with Nietzsche. Then another student who hasn't even studied, he's just snuck into the exam, but he knows how to write, he says, Callicles would disagree with Nietzsche. Quite frankly, this student could have also flipped the coin and said, Callicles would agree with Nietzsche. They're being strong in their voice, but they're not actually proving that they know anything. In contrast to Nietzsche's view that the discipline of suffering leads to self-improvement, which is his conception of a good life, Callicles finds such suffering contemptible because it detracts from the constant expansion of satisfied desires that gives rise to the life of pleasure, hedonism, which he feels constitutes a good life. All I've done is said, that obviously that sounds so much better, but all I've done is said why. I've added in what they think. I've used technical terms just to really sort of shove it down my examiner's throat, but I haven't done much more than the previous line. I've just said why. So Callicles would disagree with Nietzsche. In contrast to Nietzsche, okay, so this is where the contrast, and this is what Nietzsche says, and then in contrast to that, Callicles, who says this, would disagree. Maybe I should break this into 2 sentences to make it easier to control and read. Have a think. Can anyone identify how much demonstrated knowledge I squeeze in? Where is the evaluation? Actually, there's not really any evaluation there. There is some compare and contrast, but no evaluation. I'm not evaluating Nietzsche. I'm not evaluating Callicles. I'm just comparing and contrasting them. Let's see if we can add a little bit of evaluation. You notice we've started out. This is all the same answer. Callicles might disagree with Nietzsche about the value of suffering. That's what one student might write. A top student is probably going to push through to this. This is the same thing. But let's see how much more a top student can do. Nietzsche claims that, and going back, I'm talking here about section C, writing an essay. When you're writing an essay, I find some students get concerned about how am I ever going to get enough words? I don't know enough. Well, you do. You do know lots. It's just you realizing how to give what you know. If I go back and you are at one point in your essay wanting to say how Callicles and Nietzsche think about suffering, let's go back to boom, 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 boom. This idea of, where's our question? This question here. Okay? This question about how technology has been thought to be a liberator. All right? Now, let's go back to that example of the washing your clothes in a river. Washing your clothes in a river takes an hour. It's work. Callicles would prefer to have technology, i.e. concrete example, a washing machine, because the washing machine takes 5 minutes, giving him theoretically 55 minutes of pleasure time he can use for pleasure. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of criticism we can go into there, evaluation about how does he afford the washing machine, what does he have to do to get to washing machine, does he end up having to do more work than the hours work, does he have to work an entire week in an office block so that he can afford to buy a washing machine? Okay, there's a lot of evidence that show traditional societies had enormous amounts more leisure time than what we do now. But let's look at Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, he might say that the work was suffering and that being freed up, you're freed from suffering. Obviously, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. So now we want to talk about how Callicles and Nietzsche view suffering. And the most basic sentence we might write in our essay is, Callicles might disagree with Nietzsche about the value of suffering. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 words. And we're sitting there in the exam going, whoa, 10 words, brilliant. What next? Well, the top student is going through and they're doing this. Nietzsche claims that the discipline of suffering leads to self-improvement, which is his conception of a good life. Simple. There's that one sentence about Nietzsche. You can do it with every one of your thinkers. However, Callicles finds suffering contemptible because it detracts from the constant expansion of satisfied desires, which give rise to the life of pleasure that he feels constitutes a good life. So there's the compare and contrast, and I've basically said what each of them think, and I've used a technical term. Nietzsche's extolling of suffering is supported by the example of physical training. Here's a concrete example where pain is a sign of pushing the muscles to greater strength. However, this idea is challenged by types of suffering that have no evident value in leading to improvement. For example, a terminally ill child. That was evaluation. However, this idea is challenged. I'm evaluating. I'm looking at a weakness. I'm looking at a challenge here. And I'm giving a concrete example. Pleasure as the criterion or measure of a good life seems more intuitively appealing than suffering. You notice I don't say it is better It is right, I say intuitively appealing. However, Callicles' idea of, there should be a apostrophe after Callicles, idea of an ever-expanding pleasure seems to give rise to a life of entrapment and dependency, as Socrates demonstrates with his leaky jar analogy. So I'm evaluating Callicles by using Socrates, and I'm demonstrating I know the texts that I've studied with the reference to the leaky jar. This accords with Nietzsche's view of the herd and doesn't fit, so it fits with Nietzsche's view of the herd, and certainly doesn't fit with Callicles' hedonistic viewpoint. Moreover, excessive pleasure, such as overeating or the sexual promiscuity of a catamite, just threw that one in there just again to show how well I know the text, lead to a damage to health and consequently diminish pleasure. I'm evaluating Callicles' view there, okay? Furthermore, as Socrates shows with his opposites argument, pleasure is not the same as good. Now I didn't need to go into detail to explain the opposites argument. It's not a question about the opposites argument, so I can assume my reader understands what I mean by the opposites argument. I've used it appropriately, so I don't need to explain it. Pleasure is not the same as good. While Nietzsche's view on suffering is not convincing in all situations, it nevertheless is justifiable and provides a strong basis on which to achieve self-development. That's me sort of just offering an evaluative conclusion. Hedonism, on the other hand, seems both difficult to achieve, and even if achieved, it does not provide a convincing basis for a good life. And again, I'm talking about being convinced. How cogent is this? That, well, I'm not going to count the words, that's the same content as that original sentence we started with. That original sentence, that's what that original sentence is trying to do. What was the original sentence? Callicles might disagree with Nietzsche about the value of suffering. That's that sentence. That's how to if you're worried about getting enough words, that's how you've done. All I've done is fleshed that sentence out. Let's go back. I have looked at Callicles, and what does he say about the good life? I've said that. What does he say about suffering and how it fits in the good life? I've said that. I've looked at Nietzsche. I've said, what does he say about suffering? I've said that. And what does he say about suffering in the good life? I've said that. I've evaluated both of their positions. I have compared them first, then I have evaluated where they disagree and the strengths and weaknesses of their two positions, and then I have drawn conclusions on how this relates to the good life. That's what I've done there. Do's and don'ts evaluations. Don't. Okay, take a breather. Don't. X's argument is persuasive because it is logical. Oh, kill me. I agree with X because his argument is strong. X's view of the good life is more convincing than Y's because it makes more sense. None of this is saying anything. I find X's view of the good life more plausible because I think that, I find X's view of the good life, pleasure, more plausible because I think pleasure is the good life. Who cares what you think? Do's and don'ts of evaluation. Aristotle's function argument is persuasive because it is logical. Or maybe Aristotle's function argument is not persuasive because it is illogical. Aristotle's reasons that everything has a function. So this is how you maybe should write, what you're trying to do with that sentence there. Let's do it again. Aristotle reasons that everything has a function, ergon, that is peculiar to it. After dismissing the nutritive and perceptive parts of the soul as being shared by animals, he concludes the particular function of man is rationality. The argument is valid. However, its soundness is challenged if we ask why this function has to be peculiar. Couldn't a shared function such as life suffice? Again, we might question the vivacity of saying that only man is rational. What about elephants and dolphins? So while his argument seems intuitively persuasive, it loses its strength in light of these questions. That's what you're trying to write when you say Aristotle's function argument is logical. Okay, Aristotle's function argument is persuasive because it's logical, does nothing, you're not going to get any points for it. That's what you're trying to say. I find X's view of the good life... Okay, let's see how we could do this. I find Nietzsche's view of the good life more plausible because I agree that suffering leads to improvement. If that's what you wrote, you're not going to get any marks. You're just saying that's what Nietzsche thinks and I agree with him. If it asks you what does Nietzsche think the good life is, and you said, I think it's suffering, he thinks it's suffering, great, you're going to get 1 mark. If it says evaluate Nietzsche's view of the good life, and you say Nietzsche's view of the good life is suffering, and I think this is great, you're not going to get any marks because you haven't done the evaluation. So how would we do it? Nietzsche's belief that the discipline of suffering leads to self-improvement is made more plausible by the example of physical training, whereby suffering is a signal that muscles are being made stronger and more flexible. However, cases of valueless suffering, such as terminally ill child, do challenge his view. You'll notice that came in my answer earlier on. While it appears like I'm talking about how to do section A answers, which I am to a degree, section A is those sort of short answers are really just trying to get you to build up the way you would write about things in detail in an essay. Do Nietzsche, let's have a look. Nietzsche claims, not argues, that the discipline is... Okay. Example 1. Nietzsche claims that you notice he doesn't argue, he claims, be precise about the words you're using, that the discipline of suffering is key to self-improvement, which is what constitutes a good life. He offers the analogy of forging iron to increase its strength, although it might be seen as a false analogy because iron is obviously different from a human being. The example of physical training, where pain is a sign of pushing the muscles to greater strength, is a better argument. Is it right to use argument here? The word argument has a technical sense and it also has a colloquial sense, and it's being used in the colloquial sense there because it's not presenting an argument which has a structure. It's presenting an example which is being used to argue, and I'm putting scare marks around the word argue. So possibly what I should have done there is put scare marks around the word argument. However, this idea is challenged by types of suffering that have no evident value in leading to improvement. For example, a terminally ill child. Here's another one. I will just let you go through that one yourself. What I'm trying to do with all of these examples of evaluation is both to help you in the short answer questions, but really in the essay, when you get to the essay, you need to be showing evaluation. You need to be doing this. You can pause that and have a read through if you like. Okay. Here's a question. Recent technological developments give us greater opportunities for happiness than any other time in human history. Critically discuss this statement, drawing on relevant philosophical sources. That question was from the previous cycle. So when we were teaching this, the first year of the cycle, which was last year, we only had the sample exam to go on, and so to get the kids writing essays on this sort of idea, we were using this sort of structure and format for a question. Please look at the sample exam and last year's exam, and you'll see that the essay looks, the way the essay question is framed looks different. I've got some examples of it at the end of this PowerPoint. What are we doing? We're looking at greater opportunities. So we want to identify the greater opportunities. We want to critically discuss the statement. Okay. Technological advancement has transformed. So let's see if we can write the introduction, because I think writing an introduction, if you get a good introduction, it will frame the essay. A good introduction basically operates as a really good plan. Technological advancement, which the question was technological developments give us great opportunities. So maybe I could have written technological developments. I'm just saying that maybe I could have been more directed towards the prompt. Technological advancement has transformed the way that human society functions. Whether or not this change has been beneficial to the potential happiness of individual, however, is unclear. This essay, so all I've done is started out with that first sentence, which tries to pick up on the key word in the prompt and pose a question. It is a hook sentence. It is meant to be grabbing my reader and saying, hey, here's what we're looking at, and here's the big question we have about it. All right? So immediately my reader is asking a question. And if they're asking a question, they are engaged. If they're engaged, they are hooked. It is my hook sentence. But now I want to guide my reader. I don't want them to just be asking a question and sort of floating off into going, oh, I'm interested in that question, but I don't know what you're talking about now. This essay shall argue that a high level of self-discipline regarding how one uses technology is necessary for increasing happiness and achieving a good life, looking closely at the views of Callicles and Aristotle to do so. Bang! I have told my reader what I am going to do in this essay. I've flagged this term self-discipline, which is going to help me because I can now use it. And I've said I'm going to look at these thinkers. The rest of the essay. So look, that is about as basic. I'm not saying that's the greatest introduction of all time, but it's basically serving its purpose. Okay? That's if you're in an exam and you're feeling stressed and you just want to get on with it, that's what you do. Just get on with it. Briefly state why Callicles would support the claim in the prompt. Okay, you can read through this. It's just guiding you through what would do. Compare Callicles' hedonism. Okay. So if I just finish with that, I'm just trying to get you thinking about how to write quick plans and think logically through the structure of your essay. What am I doing? How does each thing lead to the next thing? Where am I showing evaluation? Okay. A really good practice, I don't know, probably most of your teachers will have told you to do this already, but a really good practice is to take your essay. I used to get my students to do this with all their essays, all their SACs, everything, and get a series of highlighters and have a color code that you're going to use again and again and again. And maybe you're going to have yellow for evaluation, orange for technical term, blue for reference to one of the thinkers, whatever. Write it up and then go through your essay and color code where you have done things. Okay, so you can see how much you're doing things, visually see how much you're doing things. I had a student once who did a SAC, and I said to him, have you made reference to the text? Yep, lots of reference to the text. Have you put in evaluations? Lots of evaluations. I said, right. Every reference to the text coloured in blue. I gave him a blue highlighter. He had about 5 minutes left on the SAC. Every evaluation coloured in yellow. He had 5 pages. He did that, and he had about 2 or 3 bits of blue and yellow on it, and he went, oh my God. It's because he thought he was doing it, but didn't see what he was doing until he did that. Let's have a look at section C as it stands in this cycle. This is what they look like now. They'll have a prompt of some sort, often an article, And then you've got the question. Recent debates indicate that with the increased capacity of flight technology, the role of the pilot has been diminished. Keep in mind that you do not have to have studied a whole bunch of stuff about flight technology. In fact, you may have never looked at it. Theoretically, everything you need is in that prompt. If you have done some background study to it, it will mean you'll be able to bring material extraneous to the thinkers that you've looked at. Extra material, and that looks good. And sometimes it's really, really powerful. So it really is important to have a look at a range of technological developments. Self-driving cars, flight technology, AI, virtual reality. Virtual reality. I mean, you can really clearly see a virtual reality question popping up with you're being asked to talk about Callicles and pleasure. Gaming is a huge area. Recent debates indicates that with the increased capacity of flight technology, the role of the pilot has been diminished. Some even say it's entirely the computer who flies the plane now, which isn't quite true. Nevertheless, what accompanies this development is an alleged reduction in the quality of training offering to pilots. The premise here is that since they aren't really necessary, we don't need to train them as well. There is a good economic argument for this kind of proposal. It could cost billions of dollars to provide the kind of training a pilot would need to deal with a situation that they are most likely never going to encounter in their career. Critically discuss at least one of the thinkers we've considered in Unit 4 might respond to this how at least one of the thinkers might respond to this perspective on the interplay between technological development and the good life. In your response, draw on at least one of the following concepts. Right. It doesn't tell you which thinker to do. Have a think. Who would you go for there? The pilots are no longer in control of the plane to the same degree. The pilots are becoming dependent upon the technology. So there is an element where you could talk about Nietzsche. There is an element where you could talk about the fact that they are no longer, what is the function of a pilot? By definition, it is to fly a plane, to pilot. They are no longer being able to do that. So their function is their ability to achieve their function is being decreased. So you could talk about Aristotle. Okay. Here's another one. These are some of the ones I have constructed. I last year put together around about 10 sample exams for my students. These are just some of those questions based upon the model exam. Suppose we could use genetic engineering to raise the IQ by 15 points. So the contemporary issue, the technological development is genetic engineering. And I'll let you read the rest of it. There's a source from that. It comes from an article by J. Glover, Decisions, in a book called The Moral Life. Critically discuss how either Callicles or Aristotle would respond to this perspective on the interplay. Okay, there's a couple of questions you could have a go at. And that's pretty much, I've been talking a lot over a lot of slideshows. I don't know how helpful that will be. What you need to do is practice these essays. If anyone, I would also suggest quite strongly that, as with this article by Decisions, that you read around the different technological developments. For example, genetic engineering. Have a look at last year's exam. Let's have if I just stop for a second. Genetic engineering. gaming, communication devices. What gives pleasure? Gaming is obviously gives pleasure. I mean, I don't think they're going to go into the sex industry, although there are huge technological developments being made there, particularly in virtual reality. There's some really good articles about all of these. So if you made a little list of some of the technological developments that could turn up, look up and research them. I will put into I don't know what you call it, the body of this this little video on YouTube. I will add some attachments to some articles which you might find helpful, and read these articles. Now, these articles are often as detailed and as complex as the ones you have to study, so don't read them in the same way that you're trying to study these guys. Read through, pick up key things, pick up key phrases, pick up things you might use, and be ready to use them to fill out. The examiners love to see you go beyond the text you've studied. So I hope that was a little bit helpful. It was just this has not been the best video. I'm not going to pretend that. It's just a way of trying to help you in this very, very difficult year. Good luck to all of you.